The deed was still warm in my hands when I realized my dead son had been lying to me for years. Not the kind of lie that breaks your heart slowly, like finding out he'd been skipping church or dating someone I wouldn't approve of. This was the kind that rewrites everything you thought you knew about the person you loved most in this world. 27 years. That's how long I had my boy. 27 years of bedtime stories, scraped knees, graduation photos, Sunday dinners where he'd steal extra cornbread when he thought I wasn't looking. 27 years of believing I knew him inside and out. Then came that Tuesday night when the phone rang at 11:47 p.m., and everything I thought I knew turned to dust. "There's been an accident." The voice on the other end was professional, distant, like they'd said these words 1,000 times before. I remember gripping the kitchen counter, my knuckles white, waiting for the part that would make sense. The part where they'd tell me he was hurt but breathing, scared but alive. Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family, enjoy the story. But that part never came. My only son was gone, and I was left standing in my kitchen at midnight, holding a phone that felt like it weighed 100 pounds. The funeral was a blur of black dresses and casseroles. People kept hugging me, whispering things like, "He's in a better place," and "God needed another angel." But all I could think about was the last conversation we'd had. He'd called me 3 days before the accident, his voice tight with something I couldn't name. "Mama," he'd said, and there was that tone again. The same one he'd used since he was 16 whenever anyone mentioned the old farm on Wickham Road. "Remember what I told you about that place?" "Of course, baby. You told me never to go there." "I mean it. Promise me again. No matter what happens, don't ever go to that farm." I'd laughed it off, like I always did. "You still worried about that old place? Honey, I've got better things to do than visit some rundown farm." But now, sitting in his empty apartment, going through his things like the funeral director had suggested, I couldn't shake the memory of his voice. The urgency in it. The fear. That's when I found it. I was cleaning out his desk, the one he'd had since high school, when my fingers brushed against something taped to the inside of the bottom drawer. A manila envelope, sealed tight and marked with my name in his careful handwriting. Inside was a single piece of paper that made my blood run cold. A property deed. For the Wickham Road farm. The very place he'd spent 11 years warning me to stay away from. My hands started shaking as I read the legal language, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The deed was in his name, dated 3 years ago. 3 years he'd owned this property without telling me. 3 years of keeping this secret while warning me away from the one place that was apparently important enough for him to buy. I sat there on his bedroom floor, surrounded by boxes of his clothes and books, holding proof that my son had been living a double life. The boy who used to tell me everything, who called me every Sunday without fail, who brought his laundry home until he was 25 because he said my washing machine worked better than his. That boy had been keeping secrets. The house felt too quiet, too empty. I could almost hear his voice echoing off the walls, all those years of warnings. "Don't go there, Mama. Promise me. No matter what." Well, baby, I thought, folding the deed and sliding it into my purse. "You're not here to stop me anymore." I stood up, brushed the dust off my knees, and made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, I was going to find out what my son died protecting me from. What I discovered at that farm would make me question everything I thought I knew about justice, truth, and the lengths a mother will go to honor her child's memory. Would you keep a promise to someone who'd been lying to you their whole life? Tell me in the comments what you would do. He was 7 the first time he saw the farm, and it changed him forever. I remember that day like it was yesterday. We'd been driving back from his piano lesson when I decided to take the scenic route home. The autumn leaves were perfect that year, all gold and crimson, And I wanted to show him how beautiful our little town could be when you took time to notice. That's when we passed Wickham Road. "Look at that old place," I said, slowing down so we could get a better view. "Your great-grandfather used to tell stories about farms like that. Said they held all kinds of history." But when I glanced in the rearview mirror, my boy had gone pale. His little hands were pressed against the window, his eyes wide with something I'd never seen before. Not fear exactly. Something deeper. "Mama," he whispered, his 7-year-old voice barely audible. "We need to go. Now." I laughed, the way mothers do when their children say something strange. "What's wrong, baby? It's just an old farm." But he wouldn't stop staring. Even as we drove away, he kept his face pressed to that back window until the farm disappeared behind the trees. That night, he had his first nightmare in years. From that day forward, everything changed. My sweet, curious boy who used to explore every corner of our neighborhood suddenly refused to walk down Wickham Road. When his friends wanted to ride bikes near that area, he'd make excuses. When we drove past it on the way to anywhere, he'd close his eyes or look down at his hands. At first, I thought it was just a phase. Kids get scared of strange things sometimes. But as he got older, the fear transformed into something else. Something protective. "Don't go there, Mama." He must have said those words to me 100 times over the years. At 10, it was a child's worried request. At 15, it became an urgent warning. By the time he turned 20, it was practically a command. I used to tease him about it. "What do you think is going to happen? The barn's going to come to life and chase me down the road." But he never laughed. Never smiled. Just looked at me with those serious dark eyes and said, "Promise me you won't go there." So I promised. Again and again and again. Because that's what mothers do. We promise our children things to make them feel safe, even when we don't understand why they need that safety. Now, sitting in my car outside his apartment building with that deed burning a hole in my purse, I realized how little I'd understood about my own son. 3 years ago, while I was promising him I'd stay away from that farm, he was secretly buying it. While he was warning me off the property, he was signing papers to become its owner. The contradiction made my head spin. What had he been protecting me from? And why did he feel the need to own the very place he feared? I drove home in a daze, the deed tucked safely in my purse like a ticking bomb. That night, I spread his childhood photos across my kitchen table, looking for clues I might have missed. There he was at 8, grinning with his missing front teeth. At 12, trying to look serious in his school picture. At 16, tall and lanky in his first suit for homecoming. In every single photo, he looked like my boy. Open, honest, the kind of kid who couldn't keep a secret if his life depended on it. Except, apparently, he could. I poured myself a glass of wine and tried to think like a mother instead of a grieving woman. What would make a child that young react so strongly to an old farm? What would make a grown man buy property he'd spent his whole life avoiding? The more I thought about it, the more questions piled up. Where did he get the money to buy a farm? Why hadn't there been any paperwork about it in his apartment? Why keep the deed hidden in a place where only I would find it? Unless he wanted me to find it. Maybe this wasn't a secret he was keeping from me. Maybe it was a secret he was keeping for me. Maybe those years of warnings weren't about protecting me from the farm at all. Maybe they were about protecting me until the right time came. I finished my wine and made a decision. Tomorrow morning, I was going to break the promise I'd made to my son 100 times over. I was going to drive to Wickham Road, walk through those farm gates, and find out what was so important that he gave his life protecting it. What I didn't know was that some secrets are buried so deep, even the dead can't rest until they're uncovered. Don't forget to like this video if you believe promises can hide deeper truths. The gates stood open like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. I sat in my car for 10 minutes, engine running, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles had gone white. The farm looked different than I remembered from all those years of driving past. Smaller, somehow. More ordinary. But there was something in the air that made the hair on my arms stand up. Something that told me I was crossing a line I could never uncross. The gravel driveway crunched under my tires as I pulled through those gates. Every sound seemed too loud in the morning quiet. A crow cawed from somewhere in the oak trees, and I jumped like I'd been shot. This was ridiculous. I was a grown woman, for crying out loud. I'd buried my son 3 days ago. I could certainly handle visiting an old farm. But my heart hammered against my ribs anyway. The farmhouse sat at the end of the drive like it was posing for a postcard. White clapboard siding, green shutters, a wraparound porch that had seen better days. It should have looked welcoming. Instead, it looked like it was watching me. I parked next to the front steps and sat there for another moment, trying to convince myself to get out of the car. This was what my son had been protecting me from? This tired old house that probably hadn't seen a family in decades? But when I finally opened the car door and stepped onto that gravel, I understood. The silence was wrong. Not the peaceful quiet of the country, but the kind of silence that comes when everything living has learned to hold its breath. No birds singing. No insects buzzing. Even the wind seemed to whisper around the edges of the property instead of blowing straight through. I walked to the front door, my footsteps echoing off the porch boards. The door was painted red, though the color had faded to the shade of dried blood. There was no doorbell, just a heavy brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. But before I could use it, I tried the handle. Unlocked. Of course it was unlocked. My son had owned this place. He would have had keys. But somehow I hadn't expected the door to just open. Like the house had been waiting for me. The inside smelled like dust and something else. Something metallic that caught in the back of my throat. The front room was empty except for a few pieces of furniture covered in white sheets. Sunlight filtered through grimy windows, casting everything in a gray, underwater glow. My footsteps on the hardwood floor sounded like gunshots in the silence. I walked through the house room by room, looking for some clue about why this place had haunted my son for 20 years. The kitchen had old appliances and a table set for two, like someone had just stepped out for a moment. The living room had a stone fireplace with cold ashes still scattered on the hearth. Everything looked normal. Abandoned, but normal. It wasn't until I reached the staircase that I found the first real sign that my son had been here. Tucked under the bottom step, almost invisible unless you knew where to look, was a cardboard box. Not just any box. A banker's box, the kind lawyers use for storing files. And written on the side in my son's careful handwriting were 2 words that made my blood run cold. For Mama. I pulled the box out with trembling hands. It was heavier than I expected, packed tight with folders and papers. But before I could open it, I heard something that made me freeze. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from upstairs. Someone else was in the house. My breath caught in my throat as I listened to those footsteps move across the floor above my head. Back and forth, like someone pacing. Like someone who'd been waiting up there for me to arrive. I clutched the box against my chest and tried to think. My son was dead. The house had been empty for 3 years. Who could possibly be upstairs? The footsteps stopped. And in that sudden silence, I realized the truth was about to reveal itself whether I was ready or not. The footsteps weren't coming from upstairs at all. They were coming from outside. From the back of the house, where someone was walking across the gravel with the slow, steady pace of a person who belonged there. A person who had every right to be here. Which meant I was the trespasser. I clutched the box tighter and crept to the kitchen window, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Through the grimy glass, I saw him. An old man in overalls and a faded baseball cap, carrying a toolbox toward a small shed behind the house. He moved like he'd made this walk 1,000 times before. A caretaker. Of course. My son had owned this place for 3 years. Someone had to be maintaining it. I watched him disappear into the shed, then quickly carried the box to my car. Whatever secrets my son had hidden here, I wasn't going to discover them with a stranger wandering around the property. I needed privacy for this. I needed to be somewhere safe. 20 minutes later, I was back in my own kitchen with the box open on the table in front of me. The first thing I pulled out was a photograph. Black and white, edges yellowed with age. It showed a young couple standing in front of the same farmhouse I'd just left, but the house looked different. Newer. Loved. The woman wore a simple dress and held a baby in her arms. The man had his hand on her shoulder, both of them smiling at the camera like they had the whole world figured out. On the back, someone had written in faded ink, James and Eleanor Caldwell, 1952. Our first home. Caldwell. That was my maiden name. My grandfather's name. I set the photo aside with trembling hands and reached for the next item. A manila folder thick with official-looking documents. Property deeds, tax records, survey maps. All bearing the same name, James Caldwell. My grandfather had owned the farm. But that was impossible. I'd grown up hearing stories about how my grandfather worked his whole life and never owned so much as a shed. How he'd died broke and bitter, leaving nothing behind but debts and regrets. Except here was proof that he'd owned 100 acres of prime farmland and a house that could have sheltered our whole family. I spread the documents across my kitchen table, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There were receipts for farm equipment, invoices for repairs, insurance policies. All the paperwork that comes with owning property. All dated between 1952 and 1961. Then, suddenly, nothing. In 1962, the paper trail went dead. No more tax records in my grandfather's name. No more insurance payments. It was like the farm had simply vanished from his life. But I found something else. A new deed, dated 6 months later. The same property, transferred to a different owner entirely. Someone named Harrison Blake. I'd never heard that name before. The transfer document looked official enough, complete with notary seals and witness signatures. But something about it felt wrong. The signatures were too neat, too perfect. And the date. The date was 3 months after my grandfather's funeral. How do you sell property when you're dead? I kept digging through the box, looking for answers, and found them in the form of a letter. A letter my grandfather had apparently never finished writing. The paper was brittle with age, the ink faded, but the words were still readable. To whoever finds this, it began, "What they done to me ain't right. That Blake fellow come around with his fancy lawyers and his fake papers, saying I owed money I never borrowed. Said if I didn't sign over the farm, they'd take it anyway and leave my family with nothing. I was old and tired and scared, so I signed. But I kept copies of everything. The real papers that show what this place is worth. What they stole from us." The letter ended mid-sentence, like he'd been interrupted. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the paper. My grandfather hadn't died broke. He'd been robbed. Cheated out of his land by someone with enough power and money to make it look legal. And somehow, my son had found out. I reached back into the box and pulled out more recent documents. Printouts from internet searches. Legal forms partially filled out. Copies of old newspaper articles about property disputes. All of it in my son's handwriting, with notes scribbled in the margins. Blake died 1987, property passed to son. Original deed hidden in county records. Need lawyer. Mama doesn't know about this. Keep her safe until ready. He'd been investigating. Building a case. Trying to reclaim what had been stolen from our family 60 years ago. But why hadn't he told me? The answer came in the form of another note, this one written on a scrap of paper and tucked between two folders. Blake family still has connections. Lawyers, judges, police. If they know we're coming, we'll lose everything. Again. My son hadn't been protecting me from the farm. He'd been protecting me from the people who'd stolen it. And now those same people had no idea that I knew the truth. He hadn't just owned the farm. He had been fighting for it. The law office smelled like leather and broken dreams. I sat in the waiting room, clutching my purse like a life preserver, trying not to think about how much this was going to cost me. The lawyer my son had been planning to contact was booked solid for 3 weeks, but I'd found someone else. Someone who specialized in the kind of case I was about to describe. Someone who might actually believe me. Delora Martinez had been my friend since high school, back when she was Delora Williams, and we both thought we'd marry our sweethearts and live happily ever after. Life had other plans for both of us, but we'd stayed close. When she went back to school to become a paralegal after her divorce, I'd been the one cheering her on from the front row at graduation. Now I needed her help more than I'd ever needed anything. "You look terrible," she said when she saw me, which was exactly what I needed to hear. Not sympathy, not careful politeness. Just honest truth from someone who'd known me long enough to see through the makeup I'd used to hide my sleepless nights. "I feel terrible," I admitted. "But I think I've found something that might help me feel better." We drove to the farm together, the box of documents in the back seat like a passenger we were afraid to acknowledge. Delora had insisted on seeing the property before we talked about legal strategies. "Context matters," she'd said. "I need to understand what we're dealing with." What we were dealing with turned out to be bigger than either of us had imagined. The caretaker I'd seen the day before was nowhere in sight, so we had the place to ourselves. Delora walked through the house like she was conducting a crime scene investigation, taking pictures with her phone, making notes in a small notebook she always carried. "Your son was smart to document everything," she said, flipping through the folders I'd brought from the box. "But this is just the beginning. If what you're saying is true, if this property was stolen from your family, we're going to need an expert." "What kind of expert?" "The kind who knows how to spot a 60-year-old forgery. The kind who can trace paper trails through decades of deliberately buried records." She looked up from the documents and met my eyes. "The expensive kind." My heart sank. I had some savings, enough to live on for a while, but lawyer fees could eat through that faster than a house fire. "How expensive?" "More than you have." Delora's voice was gentle but firm. "This isn't a simple property dispute. This is a decades-old conspiracy involving forged documents and probably half the power structure of this county. The people who did this to your grandfather aren't going to roll over and admit they were wrong." I sank into one of the dusty chairs, feeling defeated before we'd even started. "So what do I do? Just let them win again?" "No," Delora said, and something in her voice made me look up. "We get smart. We find someone who'll work with us because they believe in what we're doing, not because they smell a big payday." That's when she told me about Professor Holden. He taught property law at the State University for 30 years before he retired. Made a name for himself going after developers who thought they could steamroll people too poor or too scared to fight back. These days, he takes on cases like this as a hobby. A hobby. The man's got more money than he knows what to do with, and he gets bored sitting around his house all day. Fighting injustice keeps him young. Delora grinned. Plus, he hates bullies. We called him from the farm kitchen, using the old rotary phone that somehow still worked. Professor Holden's voice was crisp and professional, but I could hear the interest spark in it when Delora explained what we'd found. "Bring me everything," he said. "Documents, photos, any family stories you can remember. I'll meet you tomorrow afternoon at 2. After we hung up, Delora and I sat in that quiet kitchen, surrounded by 60 years of secrets, and I felt something I hadn't felt since my son died. Hope. "You know this won't be easy," Delora warned. "Even if we can prove the original deed was forged, the current owners aren't going to just hand over the property. They'll fight us every step of the way." "Good," I said, surprising myself with the steel in my voice. "My son fought for this place alone. Now he's got help." But as we packed up the documents and prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That somewhere in the shadows of this old house, the past was stirring back to life. And it was hungry for justice. Delora said 4 words that changed everything: "We need an expert." Professor Holden's eyes lit up like Christmas morning when he saw the forged signature. "Magnificent," he whispered, holding my grandfather's stolen deed up to the light streaming through his office window. "Simply magnificent. Whoever did this was good, but they weren't perfect." I glanced at Delora, who was trying not to smile. The professor was exactly what she'd promised. 70-something years old, with silver hair that stuck up in every direction and the kind of energy that made you forget he was old enough to be my father. His office looked like a library had exploded in it, with law books stacked from floor to ceiling and papers covering every available surface. But those sharp blue eyes missed nothing. "See this?" He pointed to a tiny detail in the signature that I'd never noticed. "The ink pressure is too consistent. When people sign their names naturally, there are variations. Slight trembles, changes in pressure where they pause or speed up. This signature was traced." My heart started racing. "You mean you can prove it's fake?" "Oh, I can do better than that." He set the deed down and pulled out a magnifying glass that looked like it belonged in a Sherlock Holmes movie. "I can tell you exactly when it was forged." For the next hour, Professor Holden walked us through the evidence like he was teaching a college class. He showed us how the paper stock used for the forged documents didn't match what was standard in 1962. How the notary seal had been applied with a technique that wasn't invented until the 1970s. How the witness signatures were written with ballpoint pen ink that wasn't commercially available until years after my grandfather's death. "Your son did excellent preliminary work," he said, flipping through the folders my boy had assembled. "But he was missing the most important piece of the puzzle." "What piece?" Professor Holden grinned like a cat who'd caught the biggest mouse in the house. "The original deed. The real one. Your grandfather hid it, and I think I know where." He led us to a wall covered with maps of the county, some of them so old they looked like they belonged in a museum. His finger traced along Wickham Road until he found the farm property. "Property disputes like this were common in the 1960s, he explained. Developers would target elderly farmers who owned valuable land but didn't have the resources to fight back in court. The smart farmers, the ones who saw trouble coming, would hide copies of their real documents in places the thieves wouldn't think to look." "Where?" "The county courthouse. Not in the official records, where they could be altered or destroyed. In the historical archives. The dusty basement storage areas where they keep old documents that nobody thinks are important anymore." My pulse quickened. "You think my grandfather hid a copy there?" "I think your grandfather was smarter than the people who robbed him gave him credit for. And I think he left us a roadmap to prove it." Professor Holden pulled out one of the documents my son had found and pointed to a series of numbers written in pencil at the bottom. "These aren't random. They're a filing system reference." Within an hour, we were standing in the basement of the county courthouse, surrounded by boxes that smelled like dust and forgotten history. The clerk who'd let us in looked like she'd rather be anywhere else, but Professor Holden had a way of making people cooperate. Box 847B, he muttered, running his finger along the labels. Box 847B, where are you? When we found it, tucked away in a corner like it had been deliberately hidden, my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't open it. Delora had to do it for me. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth like a treasure, was a manila envelope marked with my grandfather's careful handwriting, Insurance Copy J. Caldwell Property Records. The deed inside was identical to the forged one we'd been studying, except for one crucial difference. This one was real. The paper was right, the ink was right, and the signatures had all the natural variations that proved they'd been written by living hands. But more importantly, this deed was notarized and witnessed by people I recognized. People whose names were carved on headstones in our local cemetery. People who'd been dead for decades, which meant they couldn't have witnessed a forged document in the 1970s. Ladies, Professor Holden said, his voice quiet with satisfaction, we just found our smoking gun. For the first time since my son died, I understood what hope felt like. Not the desperate kind that keeps you awake at night, but the solid, steady kind that builds something real. My grandfather had been smarter than anyone imagined. My son had been braver than I'd ever known. And now it was my turn to finish what they'd started. But the fight was only beginning, and they were about to hit back harder. The first threat came in a plain white envelope with no return address. "Drop this nonsense or you'll regret it," the letter said in block letters that looked like they'd been written by someone trying to disguise their handwriting. "Some stones are better left unturned." I found it tucked under my windshield wiper after leaving Professor Holden's office, where we'd spent the morning filing the legal paperwork to freeze any sale or development of the farm property. The injunction was temporary, but it would hold long enough for us to build our case. Apparently, someone wasn't happy about that. "They're scared," Delora said when I called her. Good. Scared people make mistakes. But I wasn't feeling good about it. I was feeling like a woman who'd just painted a target on her back. The second threat was more direct. I came home from the grocery store to find my front door standing wide open, even though I was certain I'd locked it. Nothing was missing, but someone had been through my house. My kitchen drawers had been opened and closed just slightly wrong. The cushions on my couch weren't quite where I'd left them. Small things that most people wouldn't notice. But I noticed. And whoever had been there wanted me to know they'd been inside. I called the police, but the officer who came to take the report looked like he'd rather be writing parking tickets. "No signs of forced entry," he said, like that explained everything. "Maybe you forgot to lock up. Grief can make people forgetful." Grief. Like I was some confused old woman who couldn't remember if she'd secured her own home. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind in the trees outside, sounded like footsteps. Like someone watching. Like someone waiting for me to let my guard down. But the worst part wasn't the fear. It was the doubt. Maybe the police officer was right. Maybe I had forgotten to lock the door. Maybe the grocery store cashier had dropped that letter and it had blown onto my car by accident. Maybe I was seeing threats where none existed because I couldn't handle the idea that my son had died for nothing. I was sitting at my kitchen table at 3 in the morning, staring at the legal documents and wondering if I was losing my mind, when my phone rang. "Mrs. Caldwell?" The voice was unfamiliar, professional. "This is Harrison Blake Jr." The name hit me like ice water. Blake. The family that had stolen my grandfather's farm. "I understand you've been asking questions about some old property records," he continued, his voice smooth as butter and twice as fake. "I wonder if we might meet for coffee tomorrow. I think there's been a misunderstanding that we could clear up very easily." My hand tightened on the phone. What kind of misunderstanding? The kind that tends to get expensive for everyone involved. I'd hate to see you spend your retirement savings on a legal battle you can't win. The threat was wrapped in politeness, but it was still a threat. This man knew I was living on a fixed income. He knew I couldn't afford a prolonged court fight. He was counting on me to fold like a cheap card table. "Mr. Blake," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I think you're the one who's misunderstood something." "What's that?" "I'm not fighting this battle alone." I hung up on him and immediately called Delora. "He called you directly," she said, and I could hear her sitting up in bed. "That's either very stupid or very desperate." "Which one is good for us?" "Both. But it also means they're going to escalate. You can't stay in that house alone anymore." She was right, but I wasn't ready to admit it. This was my home. The place where I'd raised my son, where every room held memories of him growing up. I wasn't going to be driven out by some fancy threat from a family of thieves. But when I went to check the locks on my doors one more time before hanging up, I found something that made my blood run cold. The kitchen window, the one that looked out over my backyard, was open about 2 inches. Just enough for someone to slip their fingers under the frame and lift it higher. Just enough for someone to climb through. I grabbed my purse and keys and was out the front door within minutes, driving through the dark streets to Delora's house with my hands shaking on the wheel. Someone had been in my house while I was on the phone with Blake. Someone who wanted me to know that locked doors wouldn't keep them out. But as I pulled into Delora's driveway, I realized something else. For the first time since this whole thing started, I wasn't afraid. I was angry. And anger, I was learning, was a much more useful emotion than fear. My son had died protecting this truth. My grandfather had been robbed of his life's work. And I'd be damned if I was going to let them intimidate me into giving up now. They wanted a fight? Fine. They were about to get one. I realized someone wanted me too afraid to keep going. The courthouse steps felt like a stage, and I was about to give the performance of my life. 3 weeks had passed since that night at Delora's house. 3 weeks of preparation, documentation, and sleepless nights spent rehearsing everything I'd say when this moment came. Now, walking up those granite steps with Professor Holden on one side and Delora on the other, I felt like I was carrying my son's ghost with me. The hearing was supposed to be routine. A simple matter of presenting evidence to support our injunction against any sale or development of the farm. But the moment I saw the crowd of suits waiting inside, I knew this was going to be anything but simple. Harrison Blake Jr. stood at the center of it all like a spider in a web. Tall, silver-haired, expensive suit that probably cost more than my car. He had the kind of smile that never reached his eyes and the kind of handshake that lingered just long enough to let you know he was measuring you. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said when he saw me, "I'm so sorry for your loss. Your son was a fine young man." The way he said it made my skin crawl. Like he'd known my boy personally. Like they'd been friends. "Thank you," I managed, wondering how he'd learned about my son's death and what else he might know about my family. His lawyers filled 2 entire tables. Corporate types with briefcases that looked like they cost more than most people's monthly salary. Our side consisted of Professor Holden, a stack of banker's boxes, and me clutching a folder of photographs like my life depended on it. We looked ridiculous. Outgunned. Exactly the way they wanted us to look. But Professor Holden had taught me something important in those 3 weeks of preparation. Sometimes looking weak is the strongest position you can take. People underestimate you. They get careless. They make mistakes. And Blake's team was about to make a big one. The hearing started with their lawyer presenting what he called a straightforward property dispute. According to him, my family had never owned the farm. My grandfather had been a tenant farmer who'd gotten confused about his legal rights. The documents I'd found were either forgeries or misunderstood rental agreements. It was all very polite, very professional, and complete nonsense. But it sounded convincing. The judge, a tired-looking man who clearly wanted to get home to his dinner, nodded along like he'd heard this story 100 times before. Another family trying to claim property that didn't belong to them. Another waste of the court's time. That's when Professor Holden stood up. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from 30 years of teaching law students, "before we proceed, I'd like to present some evidence that I believe will clarify the situation." What happened next was like watching a magic trick. Professor Holden didn't raise his voice. He didn't wave papers around or make dramatic gestures. He simply, methodically, destroyed every lie Blake's lawyers had told. He showed the judge the forged signatures, explaining exactly how the ink analysis proved they'd been created decades after my grandfather's death. He presented the timeline of events, demonstrating how the property transfer had occurred 3 months after the funeral. He walked through the financial records, showing how my grandfather had been making mortgage payments on land he supposedly never owned. But the moment that changed everything came when he placed the original deed on the judge's desk. This document, Professor Holden said, was notarized by Thomas Mitchell on March 15, 1962. Mr. Mitchell's signature appears on hundreds of legitimate documents in this courthouse's archives. I've brought samples for comparison. Blake's lead lawyer, a sharp-faced woman who'd been taking notes throughout the presentation, suddenly looked up. "Your Honor, we'd like to request a recess to examine." "No recess necessary," the judge interrupted, studying the deed through his reading glasses. "Mr. Mitchell notarized my parents' marriage certificate in 1963. I know his signature." The silence that followed was the kind you feel in your bones. Blake's entire legal team sat frozen, staring at evidence they couldn't explain away or discredit. Because you can't argue with the dead. And in that silence, I heard something that made my heart race. The sound of truth finally being heard. The judge looked up from the documents, his tired expression replaced by something sharper. Something that suggested he didn't appreciate being lied to. "Mr. Blake," he said, "I think you and I need to have a conversation about the authenticity of the documents your family has been using to claim ownership of this property." Blake's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady. "Your Honor, I'm as surprised by these revelations as anyone. My family acquired this property in good faith. 60 years ago," the judge cut him off. "When you were probably still in diapers. Which means either your father was involved in document forgery, or you've continued a fraud without bothering to verify the legitimacy of your claim." The courtroom was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. And with one final document, the silence shattered. The settlement offer came on a Tuesday, delivered by a messenger who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. 24 hours. That's how long it took for Blake's army of lawyers to go from confident swagger to desperate damage control. The judge had scheduled a full hearing for the following month, but apparently Blake wasn't interested in waiting that long to resolve things. $2 million, Delora read from the legal document, her voice flat with disbelief. "They're offering you $2 million to walk away and never speak of this again." We were sitting in Professor Holden's office, the settlement papers spread across his desk like a peace treaty written by people who didn't believe in peace. The professor was leaning back in his chair, fingers steepled, wearing the kind of smile that made me think of a chess player who'd just spotted checkmate. "They're scared," he said simply. "Very, very scared." $2 million was more money than I'd ever imagined having. It was enough to buy a new house, travel the world, never worry about bills again. It was the kind of money that could erase every financial concern I'd ever had. It was also blood money. "What do you think?" I asked, though I already knew the answer in my heart. "I think," Professor Holden said slowly, "that if they're willing to pay $2 million to make this go away, the property is worth considerably more than that." How much more? He pulled out a folder I hadn't seen before and opened it to reveal aerial photographs of the farm and the surrounding area. Your grandfather's 100 acres sits directly in the path of the new interstate extension. The state's been planning this route for 5 years, but they've kept it quiet to avoid property speculation. My mouth went dry. What does that mean? It means, Mrs. Caldwell, that your family's farm is about to become the most valuable undeveloped land in the county. The state will need to purchase easements for the highway. Developers will want the remaining acreage for commercial projects. Conservative estimates put the value at somewhere between $15 and $20 million. 15 to 20 million. No wonder Blake was desperate to settle. But it wasn't really about the money, and we all knew it. This was about something bigger. Something that went to the core of who I was and who my son had been. My grandfather died thinking he'd failed his family, I said, voicing the thought that had been haunting me since we'd started this fight. My son died trying to fix that failure. If I take their money and stay quiet, what does that say about the kind of woman who raised him? Delora reached across the table and squeezed my hand. It says you're human. There's no shame in taking a settlement that would set you up for life. But there's no honor in it either. Professor Holden was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. There's a third option, he said finally. We can counteroffer. Counteroffer what? Full restoration of the property to your family name. Public acknowledgement of the fraud. And a percentage of any future development profits. He leaned forward, his eyes bright with the thrill of the hunt. We make them admit what they did. In writing. On the public record. The idea sent a chill down my spine. Not fear exactly. Something more like recognition. Like my son's voice whispering in my ear, urging me forward. What are the risks? They could fight us. Drag this out for years. Spend millions on lawyers trying to discredit our evidence or find loopholes we haven't thought of. His expression grew serious. Blake has connections throughout this county. Judges who owe him favors. Politicians who've taken his money. This won't be a fair fight. It wasn't a fair fight when they robbed my grandfather either, I said. But he still found a way to leave us the truth. That evening, I drove out to the farm alone. The sun was setting behind the old oak trees, casting long shadows across the land that should have been mine from birth. I walked through the rooms of the house where my grandfather had lived, where he'd made his stand against people with more money and power than he could ever hope to match. I thought about my son, driving out here in secret, carrying the weight of our family's stolen history, building his case document by document, knowing that if he was wrong, he'd lose everything, knowing that if he was right, he'd be taking on enemies who could destroy him. He'd chosen to fight anyway. Now it was my turn to choose. I pulled out my phone and called Professor Holden. Draft the counteroffer, I said. We're going to finish this. And with one final document, the silence shattered. Justice, I learned, doesn't always come with fanfare. 6 months after that phone call from my farm kitchen, I stood in the same courthouse where this whole thing had started, watching Harrison Blake Jr. sign the papers that would restore my family's name to the property deed. No cameras, no reporters, no dramatic speeches. Just a tired-looking man in an expensive suit, signing away 60 years of stolen wealth with a pen that probably cost more than most people's weekly groceries. The settlement was everything we'd asked for and more. Full acknowledgement of the fraud. Public apology published in the county newspaper. Restoration of the property to the Caldwell family name. And yes, a significant financial settlement that would ensure I never had to worry about money again. But more importantly, it was vindication. How does it feel? Delora asked as we watched Blake's lawyers pack up their briefcases and file out of the courtroom like defeated soldiers. Quiet, I said, and realized that was exactly right. This wasn't the kind of victory that came with celebration. It was the kind that came with peace. Professor Holden joined us on the courthouse steps, carrying a folder that contained copies of all the documents we'd used to build our case. "Your son would be proud," he said simply, and those 4 words meant more to me than all the money in the settlement. That afternoon, I drove out to the farm one more time. But this time, I wasn't trespassing. This time, I belonged there. I sat on the front porch of my grandfather's house, watching the sun set over land that had been in my family for 3 generations, and felt something I hadn't experienced since my son died. Not happiness, exactly. Something deeper than that. Completion. The interstate project moved forward as predicted, and the state purchased the easement rights for more money than my grandfather could have imagined. The remaining acreage attracted developers who paid handsomely for the right to build shopping centers and office parks on soil that had once grown corn and soybeans. But I kept the house and 10 acres around it, partly because it felt right and partly because I knew my son would have wanted me to. I visit often now, bringing books to read on the porch or just sitting in the quiet and remembering. Sometimes I write letters to my boy, telling him about the legal victory and the money and the way his secret fight had finally paid off. But mostly, I tell him about the peace. The farm has become my sanctuary, the place where I go when the world gets too loud. Where I can sit with the ghosts of 3 generations and know that we did right by each other in the end. I've started a small non-profit with part of the settlement money, helping other families who've had their property stolen through legal fraud. Professor Holden serves on the board, and Delora handles the day-to-day operations. We've won 12 cases so far, recovering everything from family farms to city lots that were taken by people who thought nobody would notice or care enough to fight back. My grandfather's legacy isn't just the land anymore. It's the reminder that truth has a way of surfacing, even after 60 years of being buried. That justice doesn't always come quickly, but it comes. And that sometimes, the quiet victories are the ones that matter most. I lost my only son, but I carry forward everything he taught me about courage, persistence, and the importance of fighting for what's right even when you're fighting alone. Especially when you're fighting alone. The farm belongs to our family again. The truth is part of the public record. And my son's secret sacrifice has become a legacy that will outlive all of us. That's not just victory. That's immortality. I never got to tell my boy that I was proud of him before he died. But I tell him every day now, in the whisper of wind through the oak trees and the creak of old floorboards in a house that finally knows its home. Some promises are made to be broken. Some secrets are meant to be revealed. And some fights are worth every sleepless night, every threatening letter, every moment of fear. Because in the end, quiet courage wins. Truth matters. And love, the kind of love that crosses the boundary between life and death, never really ends. It just finds new ways to make itself heard. If this story touched your heart and showed you that justice can prevail even when the odds seem impossible, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our powerful stories of love, courage, and the triumph of truth over lies. Share your thoughts in the comments about times when you've had to fight for what was right, and inspire others with your own stories of quiet courage. Your support helps us bring these important stories to light and reminds everyone that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary justice when they refuse to give up. Thank you for being part of our family and for believing that every story of truth deserves to be told.